Joe Manchin, the Omicron variant, and Ukraine. I'm Adam Bearne, and this is the Square Circle. Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Adam Bearne. Joining us today are Libertarian and Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, Doug Bandow. Doug, hello.
Nice to see you, Adam.
As always. And we have Conservative and Newsweek contributing editor, Peter Roff. Hello, Peter.
Good to be here.
And lastly, but not least, we have Progressive political reporter, James Rosen. Hi, James.
Hey, Adam. Always good to see you.
Well, welcome, everybody. This week, West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin broke the hearts of Democrats across the country when he announced his opposition to the Build Back Better Act. Here's the senator on Fox News.
I've always said this, Brett. If I can't go home and explain it to the people of West Virginia, I can't vote for it. And I cannot vote to continue with this piece of legislation. I just can't. I've tried everything humanly possible. I can't get there.
You're done. This is a no.
This is a no on this legislation. I have tried everything I know to do.
So, Doug Bandow, is this the end of Biden's Build Back Better plan, or could we see it resurrected in some other form somewhere down the line?
Certainly some of the programs could be brought back. I doubt we'll see an omnibus bill like the one that fell, but you could imagine popular parts of that program might get positive votes, and Manchin might vote for that. Of course, he's not the only marginal voter. There's Sinema, there's Hassan and others in the Senate. The House is also close. But the Democrats could pull something out of this if they remember that they have a small majority and not an uber majority that got them the New Deal and the Great Society.
Yeah, and on that point, James Rosen, I've heard it being described as President Biden trying to pass an FDR-style plan without having an FDR-style majority. So has he tripped up here, bitten off more than he can chew?
Yeah, he has far from an FDR style majority. He has far from an LBJ style majority. And although he's a nice fellow, he has far from FDR, LBJ political skills. And I think the package was too ambitious. On the other hand, Manchin, I think, has not been consistent. He's been on, he's been off, he's been on, he's been off. I mean, the program's been changing. In some ways, this is how huge, I agree that in all likelihood now, we're not going to see a major piece of legislation with this high of a price tag. I agree with Doug. This is how legislation historically gets made on big programs. It's on again, it's off again, it takes a long time. There's an old saying, you don't want to see how sausage is made in the restaurant, and you don't want to see how news gets reported in the newsroom. You also don't want to see how legislation gets made in Congress. So I don't know if it's always hard to know how much of this is negotiating ploy on all sides and how much of it is for real. But yeah, the Democrats have a super thin majority. They really have no majority in the Senate. Vice President Harris cast a tie-breaking vote, and they have a thin majority in the House. And President Biden came in, acting like he had a big mandate to pass sweeping legislation. He did get one big COVID relief bill passed. But he got, I believe, am I right? The infrastructure bill is now law. It's hard to, he got the infrastructure bill passed. So those are two big bills. But this is a really, really big bill with a big price tag, and it's hard to pass with, no majority or thin majority.
And Peter Roff, to James's point there, some have been arguing that as disappointed as Democrats are to have passed with no majority, as James points out, the rescue plan and the infrastructure bill, which have eluded the past two presidents, that President Biden's actually doing pretty well here.
If they believe that President Biden is doing well, I have a bridge in Brooklyn I would like to sell them. He's down 20 points in his approval rating since he took into office. His approval rating is now lower than what Trump's was consistently for most of his presidency, certainly before the pandemic started, and it's according to Gallup poll. He has failed to achieve his big government socialist dreams. The infrastructure package passed because Republicans got behind it. The COVID relief bill passed because Republicans got behind what was eventually put into law. Mr. Biden, as far as Capitol Hill is concerned, and this is especially surprising since he spent almost 50 years up there, has largely been a cipher. He is not the engaged negotiator that he told us he was going to be during the campaign. Much of the detail of the day-to-day running of the presidency appears to be left to the White House staff, and they're doing a lousy job of it. It was Biden himself who made the FDR comparison. He wanted to be like FDR and inaugurate an era of sweeping change that fundamentally overturns everything that happened in government since Ronald Reagan became president. But it is clear to me, looking at survey data, that the American public doesn't want to go where Joe Biden and his wing of the Democratic Party want to take them.
So, Doug Bandow, this bill is unpopular, according to Peter Roff, and the poll suggests that he might be right. But when you break down each component part, it seems like each individual measure seems quite popular. So why do you think Senator Manchin has torpedoed this? Certainly the White House are putting a lot of pressure on him, asking him to explain why insulin is going to cost $1,000 a month for someone in West Virginia rather than $35 a month under this new plan.
Well, part of the problem is that the cost as presented by the administration involved a lot of gamesmanship. I mean, the CBO numbers suggest that the real cost is higher than that was presented. And I think the American people are skeptical of these kind of massive bills that plan to transform society. If you come forward with an answer to a specific problem, you might be able to make a convincing case. But it looks a lot more like social engineering. When people come in with a grand name, massive spending levels, they talk about transformation. And I think that's the problem here, is that a lot of these are genuine problems that need to be addressed. It's not clear that where Biden has come down is with the best answer. And you put a bill like this together, it's hard to have serious debate over specific issues. I mean, I think the point that was made earlier is that when you get transformational bills, you typically get back and forth. You have some fights between the parties. You have very often a large majority. You have more that goes into it. It's very hard to do what they're trying to do so quickly. Again, with a margin in the Senate and the House that simply isn't there. He overreached. No surprise that he wanted to, and progressives desperately wanted to push that very thin majority as far as they could. But I think they have run aground here. They need to regroup. And I think Peter is right that the president himself hasn't been as engaged. And that was viewed as one of his strengths, as having been a member of Capitol Hill for so long, that he could do some arm twisting and some pleading in a way that might be effective. And we simply haven't seen that.
So, James Rosen, we'll give you the last say on this topic for this week. Doug points out that President Biden might be better off just picking a few specific issues and really pushing for those. What do you think from the Build Back Better plan might still be resurrected?
Well, I'm not going to pull out specific reads and be speculative. I just want to say that I've said before on this program, Obamacare was opposed by every single Republican in Congress at the time, every single Republican. And the Republicans have tried something like 37 times to overturn it, and they've failed. And they made the exact same arguments that we're hearing tonight: social engineering, socialism, too expensive. It's a popular program, and it was only passed, 10, 15 years ago? And you can go back further in time to LBJ's attempt to pass Medicare. You can go back further to FDR's attempt to pass Social Security. We really hear the same tired, unoriginal arguments that have no substance. They're just kind of buzzwords. So I'll say that conservatives of either party have made these kinds of arguments over and over and over again, and history keeps proving them wrong. And I don't know what will happen with this bill, but it would be bad. It would be really good if we heard substantive arguments rather than just buzzwords like social engineering and socialism.
Well, it looks like the popularity of the Build Back Better plan, we might never find out if it ever becomes popular in the same way the Affordable Care Act has. But let's move on, because also this week, the Omicron variant took over the Delta variant as the dominant strain of the coronavirus here in the US. But while Omicron is spreading quickly, there is evidence emerging that it's not as serious as the Delta variant. So, Peter Roff, we're seeing sporting events be cancelled. We're seeing mask mandates come back into place. Are we overreacting here? Could this be a blessing in disguise? Or are these prudent measures given just how transmissible the Omicron variant is proving to be?
I think it is an overreaction. Absolutely. Hospitalizations are up, but they're not up like they were under Delta or Alpha. And the most important indicator, as far as I'm concerned, is the number of people who are dying. And the current variation is not nearly as lethal as either Delta or Alpha, the original COVID-19. This is good news. People are receiving natural immunity by contracting the current virus. Whether it penetrates the vaccine is not clear. Some studies have suggested that the vaccine does not protect you. Others say it does, but there are studies now coming out. I saw one today, and I apologize for not remembering where it's from, that says that once you have a form of COVID-19, you are protected for life against all variants. At least that's the latest thinking. I believe that to be the case. And I am hopeful that this transmission will create the herd immunity that should have been one of the primary objectives of US and global anti-pandemic efforts from the start.
Of course, from the start, this virus appeared to be much more deadly, and certainly with the Delta variant, than Omicron is. So you think that even then we should have let it spread in the community?
I think that a number of mistakes were made that led to lockdowns, which I believe were a huge mistake. I think that we tried to protect everyone at the alpha phase, in the initial part of COVID-19, when in fact what we should have been doing is figuring out who the populations were who were potentially most vulnerable, most severely affected by COVID-19, and done our best to isolate them. That should have been the priority. It wasn't. And in fact, in some cases, as in New York State, Governor Andrew Cuomo went exactly in the opposite direction. He sent COVID patients into nursing homes to recover, where they infected the elderly and the infirm, and they increased the number of people who were dying from COVID-19.
Can you imagine the outcry if we had isolated fat, older people with diabetes or cancer or heart conditions? Those are the underlying conditions that make you most vulnerable. Can you imagine the outcry? I mean, Peter, you're a political realist. Do you think what you just said would have gotten off square one seriously? Isolate fat, older people with diabetes and these other conditions. You think that would have flown politically with President Trump?
I think that given the way the story unfolded, given the way the disease unfolded, a measured response, and leaving aside for a moment President Trump's ability to be measured about anything, but a measured response that focused on protecting the most vulnerable in front of us would have prevented the lockdowns. I believe that history will show that the lockdowns did more damage long-term to the American people, to the education of our children, to the health of the economy, than the virus itself. You cannot have an effective anti-pandemic strategy when the cure is worse than the disease.
Doug Bandow, let's bring you in here. It seems like the other two gentlemen are arguing about whether or not herd immunity is the strategy, especially now that we have Omicron, which appears to be less fatal. I think as we saw that in the UK, anywhere between 30 and 70% fewer hospital admissions for those who get Omicron. So is herd immunity now a viable strategy?
Well, there's certainly possible good news here, which is pandemics typically end as the viruses mutate to become more transmissible but less dangerous. I mean, in essence, you get to where we are on the flu. There are deaths from the flu, but we do have vaccines. The number of deaths is below that of COVID. So there's a possibility here of coming to essentially an equilibrium that we can live with, where you have, if not full herd immunity, you have good level of immunity, you have vaccines that give reasonable coverage, and those who get it, we're able to treat, and that most of them will not lose their lives. So that might get us to the best situation we can be in. I mean, I think that Peter is right in the sense that early on, the effort should have been focused on how do you protect those who are most vulnerable, and exactly what that means, and whether it's isolation. I mean, as James points out, you can hardly lock away everyone who's vulnerable. Nevertheless, the notion of extra precautions at nursing homes, extra precautions of patients, people with certain conditions, as opposed to those sorts of restrictions society-wide, might have been more effective. But we're well past that debate at the moment. It strikes me what we need to do now is have good analysis and good testing to see if we are in a position where we're moving towards an ending of the pandemic in a classical sense, then how we deal with that.
But let's move on now, because our final topic this week, we're going to talk about Russian President Vladimir Putin, who made some news this week about the standoff with the West over Ukraine. And here he is talking to a Sky News reporter.
You have talked a lot about security guarantees, and now we've seen your proposals. You also say you have no intention of invading Ukraine. So will you guarantee unconditionally that you will not invade Ukraine or any other sovereign country, or does that depend on how negotiations go?
Our actions will not depend on the negotiation. They will depend on the unconditional compliance with the Russian security demands today and in the historical context. In this sense, we have made it clear that any further NATO movement to the east is unacceptable. There is nothing unclear about this. We are not deploying our missiles over at the borders of the US. No. On the other hand, the US is deploying its missiles close to our home, on the porch of our house.
So, James Rosen, is there some room for negotiation here which might prevent a conflict? Or is Vladimir Putin simply asking for something he's never going to get?
It's a very tough question. I'm a former Moscow correspondent. To say that I'm no fan of the former Soviet Union is an understatement. Without getting too personal, I married a former Soviet woman, and she and I endured an incredible amount of harassment from the KGB and other agencies. I've had other personal experiences with the communists. I'm no fan of Russia, the former Soviet Union, or Vladimir Putin, who I've met personally, who I know a lot about. Having said that, he and his predecessors, including Mikhail Gorbachev, for all of his openness to the West, they all said that it would be very problematic, bordering on unacceptable, depending on the leader, if Ukraine, right on Russia's border, ever became a member of NATO. That's the rubbing point. And that's been, again, across, decades, that's been the Soviet/Russian position. And, we have to ask ourselves, I'm totally against what Putin's been doing in Ukraine. I think it's totally outrageous. But we have to ask ourselves if the Russian government institutionally is afraid of Ukraine joining NATO and then having NATO right on its border. How would we feel if we had essentially a historically anti-American military alliance, the most powerful in the world, right on our border, up against the Mexican border, or up against the Canadian border? Let's say Canada joined that organization, or Mexico joined it. How would we feel about that? So I think I see very little chance that he's going to give on his demand that Ukraine not join NATO. And then the West has a decision to make, and it's a very tough decision because there are arguments for Ukraine joining NATO. It's a very, very complicated, fraught, historically complex situation.
Doug Bandow, how do you see it? Should Ukraine be a NATO member? I mean, James points out, what about this border issue? And I'm not a geography major, but looking at the map behind me, I think we have Latvia and Estonia are NATO members, I believe, who are on the borders with Russia. So it's not exactly without precedent.
They're small, tiny countries. Right. Good point, though.
Look, I think the reality here is that the U.S. created this problem back in 2008 with the Bucharest summit, where George W. Bush essentially demanded he wanted both Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. It's not in America's interest to bring them in. We act as if these alliances are charities, where our view is we should help countries out there and protect them, even if it's not in our interest. This has never been a security interest of the U.S. I have a lot of feeling for the Ukrainians, but they've been part of the Russian Empire. They were part of the Soviet Union. We never worried about independence for them. The notion that we would be prepared to go to war with a nuclear armed power over Ukraine strikes me as being nutty. And as James pointed out, look, the documents that have been released showed that essentially Americans and Europeans lied to both Gorbachev and Yeltsin in terms of the expansion of NATO. And the U.S. is engaged in behavior the Russians have found threatening. We dismantled Serbia, a longtime ally, promoted revolutions in 2014, there was a street putsch, which we supported against a pro-Russian president. Victoria Nuland was in Kiev, caught talking on the phone about who we wanted to be prime minister. And I think that James is absolutely right. Turn this around. If the Russians had been advancing, the Warsaw Pact up into Central America, if the Russians or Soviets had supported the coup d'etat in Mexico City, if the Russians had said, why don't we have Mexico join the Warsaw Pact, Washington would be in an utter uproar. I mean, people would be freaked out. We'd have people here talking about war. So I think Putin has made it much more difficult. This is a nasty character. What he's doing right now is not good. And by making all of this public, he makes it much harder for NATO to come to an accommodation. I think this is one where you want a private understanding. You simply say, look, we're not going to bring them in. It's not in our interest. It's very hard for the West to back down now, but this needs to be negotiated. The Russians are serious on this. This is viewed as essential, vital interests. It's on their border. We have to take this seriously. I don't think Putin's going to back down without some kind of an accommodation that he thinks he can live with.
So Peter, Roff, James and Doug seem to be able to see it from Russia's perspective, at least somewhat. Do you share that view?
I can see Russia's perspective. I worry more about America's perspective. And I worry about the competency of the Biden foreign policy team, which I would characterize as at best a B- team. This is a serious crisis. It is a serious crisis that has been brewing ever since the United States and Britain promised to guarantee the territorial integrity of Ukraine in exchange in a deal with the Russians and the Ukrainians, in exchange for the Ukrainians agreeing to surrender back to the Russians all of the nuclear materials and weapons that were in Ukraine. We did not uphold our promise to guarantee their territorial integrity. We should have acted more strongly at that point. We are now in a situation where Putin's not going to back down. If Biden feels compelled to match Putin eye to eye, then we could end up in a confrontation that I don't think either country really wants. This would be the opportunity for a third-party world leader, and I would have nominated Angela Merkel, but she is no longer the German chancellor, to come forward and propose some kind of face-saving agreement that both the United States and the Russians could accept, like Russians off the border, Russians out of Crimea. We promise not to bring Ukraine into NATO. We go back to where we were, status quo, before the Russians conducted their initial incursion. I think everybody there gives a little, gets a lot, walks away, and we have a clean slate that we can start over again.
But let's go to some questions from our viewers / listeners. And we'll go to Leah Jenkins, who asks, do you think West Virginians would support Joe Manchin becoming a Republican? Surprised this didn't come up earlier. Who wants to take that one? Peter, would you like to see Joe Manchin in the Republican Party?
I think they would support it. I'm not sure Manchin is enamored of the idea. He is not a dino, a Democrat in name only. Biden's approval rating in West Virginia, the last time I checked, was 29%. And Manchin is, I believe, the only Democrat to still be in statewide office in West Virginia, which is a state the Democrats owned starting in the 1950s. They had everything there was to have. I think that Manchin is playing his cards correctly. His voters are not with the Biden agenda. He is opposing the Biden agenda, and he is standing up for West Virginia. There have been some unfortunate comments made by left-wing celebrities like Bette Midler that have not trashed Manchin so much as they have been insults to the people of West Virginia, questioning their family status, their literacy, the number of teeth in their head, other sort of unkind, cruel stereotypes, the kind of things that would not be accepted if they were said by a Republican about African Americans or Hispanics or Jews or some of the other interest groups that are such a vital part of the Democratic voter coalition. And so I think Manchin's playing it well. He's defending West Virginia against Washington.
So, Doug Bandow, this is a smart move by Joe Manchin, according to Peter. What do you think?
Well, Manchin's in an extraordinarily difficult position. As Peter indicated, he's in a state that's gone very, very Republican. He won his last re-election by a narrow margin. I mean, the challenge for him is, number one, is he's not fully a Republican either. I mean, he is a conservative Democrat. So he's at the right of the Democratic Party, but he shares some of the economic and other positions. And for him to become a Republican doesn't protect him. He likely would face a Republican primary challenge. He might lose that primary. So he's in a very difficult spot. I think that Peter is right, that from Manchin's standpoint, he wants to play it that he is independent and he's questioning the Biden agenda, that while he is a Democrat, he's not going to go along with everything. And he's complained about his treatment. And I think Peter's pointed out some of the insults directed at West Virginia. Manchin's best play here is to be able to present this as an independent standing up for the state of West Virginia, maintaining his current party affiliation, I think.
James?
Well, I mean, look, these days, given how unpopular Washington is, the establishment, it goes back to Jimmy Carter, who ran against the establishment, and before. No matter what state you're from, it's always a winning local strategy or statewide strategy to be against Washington, to be against the Washington establishment. I think that, I agree. I think it was Doug who said that he's in a tough position and he would face a Republican primary if he switched. But I think that, I don't know, I think it's getting to the point where maybe he should think about switching to the Republican parties. Others before him who were having problems with the mainstream Democrats who switched, like Jesse Helms, like Ronald Reagan, others have done well. I think he should consider it.
And I wonder what his reward might be from the Republican Party. Of course, that would virtually...
It would be substantial.
Yeah, it would virtually hand Mitch McConnell the gavel back. As
McConnell said he could keep his chairmanship. So that would be the first step, is that Manchin would retain the current chairmanship that he holds.
And I imagine that would probably be the minimum. So, okay, well, thank you all very much. I know we're running a little tight on time now, but I can't miss out our favorite section where it's time for our guests to tell us what they believe the most underreported story of the week was. Who would like to go first? In fact, Peter, I haven't heard from you for a minute. What's your most underreported story this week?
There's another news magazine in America, in addition to Newsweek, that pronounced Elon Musk as their man of the year. Now, usually that pronouncement is echoed by every other media outlet in the country. You kind of get hit in the face with it for a week or two. It's a big deal. It's discussed on the Sunday shows. It's in newspapers. It's people have arguments in print about the choice. This year, hardly a whisper. The reason for this, I think, is that Mr. Musk has chosen to oppose Biden's Build Back Better. And in a heated exchange with Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, who basically accused him of being a tax cheat and a bunch of other things, he pointed out that he would be paying $11 billion in taxes this year, which may be the single highest tax payment ever made by a single individual. And so I think that because Mr. Musk is not acceptably in the liberal camp among the billionaires like Soros and Bezos and Buffett, his honor was just allowed to slide past with nary a notice.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Maybe an alternate topic this week would have been asking who our guest's person of the year would be, but perhaps we'll save it. Perhaps we'll save it for a year-end roundup. James Rosen, what's your most underreported story this week?
Well, in Charlottesville, where I have been living of late, home to the University of Virginia, and of course, original home to Thomas Jefferson, our second president, our third president, one of our founding fathers. There's an interesting story. The main statue to General Lee was taken down. Big, huge statement and statue in downtown Charlottesville, and they had a bidding war. Believe it or not, they had not bidding war. They had kind of an auction to decide who, if anybody, wanted to buy that statue. And a group of well-to-do and prominent African Americans got together, raised money, and had the highest bid. And they bought the statue. And what they want to do is they want to melt it down and create a monument at the African American History Center. Well, now two people or groups that did not bid are coming in with a higher bid, and they want to buy the statue to put it somewhere else, to be determined somewhere else in, we don't know where, either in Charlottesville or outside of Charlottesville. So, the people who, I don't know if it's the state, but the people who held the auction are going to have to decide money or principle.
So a battle over history there, and not the last one. Doug Bandow, your most underreported story of the week.
It's how at this moment, all of our rich allies around the world want America to go to war. You know, we see the UK has made a determined effort to get us more involved with Ukraine. They even the foreign secretary hired a Beatles tribute band because it turns out that Blinken likes, the Beatles when he came to visit. And the Secretary of State for Defense, Ben Wallace, complained that the U.S. was no longer acting like policemen of the world. We've got the Israelis who are desperate to have us threaten war against Iran and promise to come up with a better deal on nuclear weapons. And we've got the Taiwanese who, of course, want us to defend them from China. So the U.S. is finding out the dangers of playing a defender of the world, that sometimes these duties come due. And the question is, how many wars at once would America be prepared to fight if all of these obligations came due at once?
Thank you very much, Doug. And I know this is not the most important part of the story, but I just wonder how bad that Beatles cover band was, because I have seen some sketchy ones in my time. But that is all we have time for this week. Thank you to our guests, and thank you for watching or listening to The Square Circle. I'm Adam Bearne, and please subscribe to our channel or give it 5-star reviews on your favorite podcast platform. But thank you very much. We'll see you next week, and Merry Christmas.